Welcome to Law Plus Liberation. We're here today with Jaden Cervantes-Fields. Jaden is the co-director of Mirror Memoirs. He's a community strategist and cultural worker. Welcome.
Thank you.
We want to talk a little bit about Mirror Memoirs, which is a national storytelling and organizing project which seeks as its mission to create a world where Black, Indigenous, and gender nonconforming children and all children are free from sexual violence. Jen, can you share a little bit about your personal journey into this work and what led you to co-direct Mirror Memoirs? How has your experience as a community strategist, and particularly interested in your role as a cultural worker, shaped the organization's vision?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. For me personally, I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse and trafficking in Los Angeles in the 90s, early 2000s. And I share that because it was during, the war on drugs and an increased militarization of police in response to that. And so for me, without having the language of abolition, I knew I couldn't trust law enforcement. Just witnessing what they were doing in my neighborhood and witnessing how they were treating Black people. Like a lot of survivors, I started doing survivor organizing in college with Take Back the Night. And at the time, it was really important for me to try to uplift other stories beyond just white cisgender girls experiencing campus rape. Well, that was very important. It was important to me to also make space for women of color, LGBT survivors, folks who were raped and sexually assaulted by like agents of the state. So in childcare and police custody and in the military, and as well as uplifting the experiences of survivors of other survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Um, I also did organizing around eating disorders and like moving beyond body positivity towards like fat liberation. I had an eating disorder for a long time. And because I was at the time a Black girl, I wasn't able to receive like treatment or like have people listen to my experiences. So a lot of what led me to organizing was my own experiences. Um, and I started doing organizing around trans healthcare access and access to gender affirming care, sexual health education, and HIV prevention. And what really led me to Mirror Memoirs was Amita, who is the founder. They were just starting to collect stories for the audio archive. And I should add that I'm a writer and a poet, and I perform poetry. And I performed a lot at that time and talked about my experiences. And we were both in LA. They approached me and asked if I wanted to share my story in the archive, and I said no. For like a year, I was like, I'm not doing this. But as a lot of folks know, me, that's very persistent. And I decided to share my story in the archive in 2017, and just kept saying yes to Mirror Memoirs. Not the time; it was just a lot of experimenting, like what if we look at the stories of child sexual abuse survivors who are LGBT and BIPOC, who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color, and see the impact of gender nonconformity on their experiences of child sexual abuse? That was my experience as well. That was a tomboy, I guess, was the language we would use. What would it look like to like together? And so shared my story in the audio archive. We brought together about 30 of those storytellers. And when we all met together, we realized that one, we wanted to connect with each other. There were folks who had known each other but didn't know that they were also survivors. And what happens if we try to organize together around ending child sexual abuse? And if we don't invest or like focus on carceral responses? A lot of the stories in the archive showed that when if the state intervened, and when it did, it usually caused more harm for the survivor. And, what if we did something else? And in the archive, we ask everyone what's their vision, and, no one said police. What's their vision for a world without child sexual abuse? It was, a lot of other things, but not more police. And so I kept saying yes to this experiment of like, okay, if we are all together and we organize together, what can that be? If we start to do research on the stories, what can that look like? I was a part of a cohort of survivors who were in the archive who did some research on the archive to look at trends that would also add to the larger research that exists about child sexual abuse. Um, and when it became clear that we wanted an organization to exist, Amita was very clear that we needed shared leadership and not just like a solo executive director. And when we had the funding I said yes to being the co-director. Um, and I think my experiences have really grounded us in the power of storytelling. That's the cornerstone of our work, and that's the beginning and stays at the root of what we do, is making space for survivors to tell their stories, but also to understand what we can learn when we're listening to the stories of survivors, and how can we bring survivors together to organize. A lot of us are leaders and visionaries, we're artists, we're doing all kinds of work in the world, but not able to have space to tend to the wounds of our survivorship. So how do we make space for that so that we can work collectively and bring also our survivorship into the work that we're doing?
It's so powerful, and I want to just mark a number of things that, if we don't sort of get into, but I think what makes me so sort of drawn to your work is the rootedness in stories and centering survivors, and then that whatever the abolitionist approach comes out of lived experiences where I think a lot of like abolitionist organizers, well-meaning, well-intentioned, may have this theory and then they kind of look towards the ground. And I think so those things are really powerful. If we have time, I would love to also ask you about we are in a moment where trans healthcare access and the the sort of uh, political climate of LGBTQ communities, but trans communities particularly, is I mean, not just under threat. I mean, it's sort of, existential, wanting to see complete erasure. And
Mhm.
before we jump into kind of talking a little bit more specifically about your methodologies at Mirror Memoirs and kind of building cultures of accountability, I was wondering if you wanted to speak to that because Supreme
Mhm.
Court, there's going to be legal decisions, there have been legal
Mhm.
decisions on this, and that directly impacts the work that you do, although that's not sort of centered in your work. But I just want to
Mhm.
give you an opportunity to speak to that since you've been organizing around that.
Yeah, I like to really ground people in the reality that um, what they're doing right now with the rhetoric around anti-trans legislation is positioning particularly transgender women and girls as predatory under the guise of protecting cisgender women and girls. Although we know that that's not really what they care about at all,
Mm,
um, which is actually the inverse of what's true.
mm,
Research, because actually the best research about child sexual abuse comes from the US government. They do most of the research
mm,
about the prevalence of child sexual abuse. A lot of that shows that um, actually it's transgender people who have higher risk of experiencing child sexual abuse are being targeted for violence because of transphobia. So to watch this administration put the inverse of what's true out there, put this narrative of, who is a predator, who is a pedophile, how do we justify harming people under the language or whatever of protection and safety,
Mm,
is what I think is the misinformation that so many people are buying into about protecting, women and girls, cisgender women and girls, when in reality, there's also a lot of research that shows that most of the harm that cisgender women and girls are facing comes from cisgender men that they know.
mm,
Um, and so they're using fear mongering and these tactics of misinformation to take away access for trans people. And at first they were doing it to sort of prevent trans children from having access to gender affirming care, even though we know, because research shows that when they have access to gender affirming care, it decreases the likelihood of suicidal ideation for trans children.
mhm,
And in some cases, they're trying to actually legislate sexually violating children by doing things like genital checks. And like there have been legislation that's trying to push that to see if it's a legitimate, cisgender or transgender child that is trying to access a sport or a bathroom or a locker room or whatever. But it doesn't stop with kids.
mm,
They're using those precedents that are being set to then expand that to take away gender affirming care for trans adults.
mm,
Um, but I really look at as they were trying, having this rhetoric, I think, in place, and start, all of these legislation that's been happening. I think we have to also, it's a missed opportunity not to acknowledge the ways that that is connected to body autonomy and all of the like abortion bans, all of that is connected. And I think this is an opportunity for a lot more solidarity for people
mm,
to recognize that when they're attacking trans people, they're overarchingly attacking bodily autonomy. And that can really impact anyone.
mm.
And, my hope is that more people can see that connection and like join in the fight to make sure that we can all have access to the healthcare that we need. Um,
I think the sort of counter narratives and the research that um, that you're doing is so critical. And so just that as a method to the work, which is a kind of a different approach. And I've also had an opportunity to see Mirror Memoirs in New York City in terms of staging, and so the cultural work. I want to now zero in a little bit around your organizational approach to harm. As you know, in the light of recent and ongoing revelations of sexual abuse in movement spaces, and particularly also of children, of minors, I think there's particularly with the farm worker organizing, but outside of movement spaces with Epstein. There's an urgent need for deeper conversations about accountability. How
mhm,
does Mirror Memoirs approach sexual violence within this abolitionist framework? What are some principles or questions that guide your work that others may be able to incorporate into their work or,
mhm.
you know, so that's I want to start with that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think for us, because we start with child sexual abuse, that already is different. There's not a lot of even survivor spaces that want to name child sexual abuse as something that happens. And we're grounded in the reality that it's not just this interpersonal thing that happens. It's so um, shrouded in silence. And so to just name that this is something that happens to a lot of people is at the root of our work. Just like lifting the veil that this is a problem that is rampant, actually. Despite there being so much research about it, like not a lot of spaces, movement, or otherwise want to talk about it. I think also we're really, we're not new or the first ones to talk about abolition with when it comes to sexual violence. There's actually a lot of organizers and movement leaders that have written about how they approach responding to sexual violence from an abolitionist framework. So we read those books together. I think for a lot of folks, well-meaning, it can be challenging to think about, okay, abolition, sure, but what about the rapists and the pedophiles? And, because a lot of our comrades have written about what they've tried when this happens within movement spaces and they don't want to dispose of anyone, we read those books together. We have an abolition book club wherein we actually like get the text, we share this. It's open to anyone, not just survivors. Anyone can join us in this. And we often invite the author or editor of the anthology to do a little of a book talk and we discuss the chapters together so we can see what people have tried. I think it can feel challenging to think like, well, what do we create if not this? And it's actually like, well, a lot of folks have tried things and they can talk about where those things might have failed, or what was challenging about it, or how they, had their analysis move from just analysis to actual practice. So that's part of how we really bring folks in who might get stuck with the like, what else is there then question. And then for us, it's really about creating a community of practice. I think abolition isn't just when the crisis happens. It's really challenging the ways that a lot of us are wired towards punishment as an answer to when harm happens. And so it's also acknowledging that, we believe all survivors are worthy of healing, but we also know that some of us will go on to cause harm. Like none of us are above causing harm. So how do we create a community of practice to be accountable for when we cause harm, even if it's not as extreme as sexual violence? So we've had a somatic accountability cohort practice space. One of our members, Daria Garina, has created a series of videos that uses different somatic practices and qigong to create tools for folks so that they can stay embodied when they are giving feedback that something has been harmful or they've been harmed, and when they are receiving feedback that they've been harmful. For so many of us, we can, immediately check out, want to get defensive if someone's like, I didn't like that something happened. Or it can feel really challenging to name that a boundary has been crossed. So having a space when the stakes are lower for us to actually practice together so that it's not, like I said, just a theory, but something that we can actually use. And so that's how we think about like it's not just in the moment when a crisis happens, but it's all of the work leading up to it. And for all of us to really interrogate where, carceral or like punishment rooted responses come from and show up in our own practices in our own everyday lives. Um, and then we also really ground in the reality that rape culture is expansive. 100% of us are raised in rape culture. And so it takes a lot of work to unlearn the ways that that shows up,
Hmm.
even in like gender policing of children and adults, not just when it comes to sexual violence, but when it comes to how we even interact with people in our everyday lives. And so, really creating space for us to unlearn a lot of those behaviors and to be in practice with each other. I think that's for us, that's the strategy around then be having our members be able to create communities of care and accountability with those who are closest to them. Like I said, we're national, and so we have members all over the country, and we understand that it's the folks that you're geographically closest to that you're going to need to really, that you're going to have some really deep relationship with. So how can you then use these tools and this analysis to create a culture where you have tools to respond if and when sexual violence happens within a movement space? And that we're not going to be quiet about it either.
Hmm.
We are going to center that like and name that this happened. Too often in movement spaces, there's this culture of secrecy where, it takes 60 years before someone feels like they can name what happened against a prominent figure or whatever. So I think I answered your question.
Yeah, no, I think I'm just sort of processing it because there's just so much richness in your response. Separately, in terms of your book club, we do have a movement library, so maybe separately, maybe you can share some of the books or readings or things that you've written. Definitely, we'll share the website. I also really appreciate the, kind of focus on the somatic practices and this relational building and creating this practice as part of our everyday. For organizations that don't are not focused on sexual violence work, what might be some suggestions to build cultures of accountability within their organizations? I think I hear a lot of times organizations say, we want to do all this stuff, but we're under-resourced. We don't, we're fighting, we're kind of putting out the fires in the areas that we're working on. Could you share maybe a few of, I mean, you have already shared some practices, other things that maybe organizations can integrate into their day-to-day, into the fabric of the culture of their organization, to begin to build cultures of accountability, concrete practices. Um, you sort of answered that, but I guess I wanted to maybe more affirmatively say what things organizations might be able to kind of
Hmm.
transfer and borrow. Yeah.
Yeah, I think some ways that organizations can try to build in more cultures of accountability, especially for survivors, I think can look like having some clear resources for survivors, acknowledging that, like, even if that's not the focus of their work, that is a part of cultures, a part of what a lot of us are surviving. That even if they don't do work for survivors, survivors are likely doing the work.
Hmm.
And so, in the resources that they have for their organizers, for their staff, for their members, including resources for survivors. Um, and I think also creating a culture where feedback is valued and acknowledging, even within a power dynamic or within a sort of hierarchy of power, that feedback is still welcome and respected and will be listened to. I think that's a small way that organizations and movements can create a culture of accountability. Not just when abuse happens, but when any kind of harm happens, when a boundary is crossed, and that there is a clear pattern to address it. Um, and, I understand that, um, part of white supremacy is that there's so much urgency, there's no time for anything,
Yeah.
but the fight. But um, if it's important enough, we make time. So taking the time to establish what are your processes to respond if something happens within your space, within your organization, because something will happen. Part of relational work, part of people being in relationship with each other is that harm happens. Um, and so I think those things are some of the like small ways that organizations can start to create a culture of accountability. That doesn't have to be like we're now going to start doing survivor-led work or focusing on sexual violence as, the core of what our work is. Um, but yeah, understanding that rape culture exists across movements as well. No matter what you're doing, I don't think people would have thought, oh, in the farm workers movement, we'd have to think about rape culture unless you understand that it exists everywhere. Unless you listen to the stories of, marginalized genders and spaces, if you listen to the stories, if you pay attention at all, then you hear the impacts of rape culture across every movement, and the impact of like patriarchal violence across every movement. And so making space for folks to share their experiences and know that they will be um, welcomed and listened to.
Mm,
Uh, and also connecting resources to folks who cause harm. You know, we don't have to dispose of people, but not pedestalizing folks so that they're above reproach, and also connecting folks to resources to for them to interrogate the why behind their behaviors.
mm.
Um, yeah, those are just some of the some of the things
No,
people.
I think in our short time, we're not going to, give like a how-to manual like on how to
Mhm,
do work that. I think one of the things I've learned, from Amita is just this has to be ongoing work. And you've
mhm,
said it as well. And I want to just lift up something that you said is that whether you're doing directly or, gender-based violence or work around childhood sexual abuse, survivors are doing the organizing given the statistics on how prevalent,
mhm,
um, rape culture is, childhood sexual abuse is, the likelihood of having a survivor within your organization is going to be high. It's just the
mhm,
numbers are going to be that. And therefore, that, so, I think your phrase, survivors are doing the work, and therefore it has to be part of every organization and movement. And
mhm,
that sort of gets me to this area that I wanted to talk about is oftentimes rape, childhood sexual abuse is like put into the domain of the private sphere. And I
mhm,
know that Mirror Memoirs talks about this as interconnected and broader. And I was wondering if you can share that perspective and how we can shift our understanding of
mhm,
childhood sexual abuse from being private violence to actually something very much rooted in systems of oppression. And you talked earlier about how many survivors are experienced violence from the hands of law enforcement, from the state. And so this is very much a public safety, public health in broader
mhm.
matter. Like it's not a private matter. So I was wondering if you can share that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. We really try to help people understand that child sexual abuse is at the root of empire. It's a tool of colonization, racism. You know, in the US, it's how this country was built. It was built on the rape and sexual assault of indigenous children and trafficked Africans. Um, and all of these state systems are also places where these same people experience a heightened risk of child sexual abuse. We see it, in detention centers, the news reports are reporting on the high rates of children being raped in detention centers right now. It happens in prisons. It happens through the child welfare system. It happens in psychiatric institutions. All of these state systems that are quote unquote supposed to serve as a system of protection are also places where children are being raped. And when you think about intersectionality, these added layers of racism, of the policing of gender is where it increases for particularly Black, Indigenous, and trans and gender nonconforming children. Um, and so if we can really understand that it's the air we're breathing, it's the water around us, like it's actually everywhere, then it's hard for it to continue to be seen as this private thing that happens between one child and one adult. It's actually rooted in, even the ways that we talk about children, children, for example, they have no rights whatsoever. They have no legal protection. And so there's very little incentive to listen to them. And, if we're looking at the ways that the weird, in my opinion, ways of gender policing and gender enforcement, a weird binary of gender enforcement on children that is very rooted in, in my opinion, rape culture, that's creating an environment where where rape culture can thrive and where children can be further harmed. For a lot, for us, our work is really rooted in a study from the American Academy of Pediatrics that came out in like 2013, I want to say. And, that's not like a queer publication, they're just out here doing the work. They don't care to skew things in any particular way, but they found that gender nonconformity was elevated the risk of being targeted for child sexual abuse for children. And they're not thinking of like, here's a trans child. They're talking about like a little boy who doesn't want to play sports or a little girl who's a tomboy. And, we can sort of see that like it's that gender policing of a child, or it's an adult that recognizes the difference in a child and uses gender affirmation to groom them, knowing that the adults around them are policing their gender very harshly. And so it's things like that we have to understand, like creates a culture wherein children aren't going to be listened to because they're already not being listened to about how they want to express themselves because there's already so much policing about how they want to be in their bodies. They're also not being taught how to be present in their bodies or taught how to understand what's happening in their bodies. And so then there's not language to understand or name what's happening to them. And what we found in the archive, when folks, if a child did disclose to an adult, like a parent, that something was happening, they often weren't believed the first time.
Yeah.
And so also understanding that that's what keeps this in people's minds as like this private thing or something that's rooted in secrecy. We also have to move beyond uh this as like this just happens in this certain kind of context, because there's also research to show that often a child will tell a same age peer what happened to them,
Hmm.
and then maybe won't talk about it again. And so if we listen to that research, that then to me seems like we should be teaching children, proper emotional intelligence to like, how do you actually respond when you hear this from another child?
Mm.
And, how do you then find a safe adult to tell? And how does that maybe not trigger mandated reporting, but, you know, trigger some intentional responses to like what is happening in this child's life and what is missing in this child's life? What are the resources that this kid and potentially their family need to remove them from the violence that they're experiencing and remove this adult from harming them? But when it's talked about as this like private issue, it then isn't uplifted where it needs to be to something that folks can actually organize around ending. Folks can say like, no more prisons, no more borders,
Mm.
but I think it's a lack of a political imagination to say like a world where children don't get raped.
Mm.
But I think we can get there, you
Yeah, no,
know.
definitely. And what's so interesting in what you're sharing and the resources when you talked about the American Academy of the Pediatrics, I mean, and earlier resources from the US, the state, the research is there and it's pointing us in the direction of the work that needs to happen. Essentially, like, it's being ignored, and I'm so, to me, that is very revealing and telling. And I also appreciate the connection to the gender policing. As a parent, I know this. I've observed this very well, and just seeing the children experiment uh,
Hmm.
with themselves. They're getting to know the world, and the intense reaction that people give, and is showed to me the way in which like society also is disciplining. Meaning,
Mm-hmm.
if you cross these gender binaries, there's ways in which society, pretty violently put you in your place, and children observe that very clearly. So I appreciate you for that. I want to um, dig deeper because your expertise, particularly yourself and for Memoirs, is on the cultural work and
Mm-hmm.
as a poet, as a writer. And you've developed these stories, you've created this archive. So I was wondering if you can share, if other organizations would like to take that approach of
Mm-hmm.
storytelling, developing an archive, that then becomes kind of the knowledge base, right? You're creating this independent knowledge base,
Mm-hmm.
knowledge production. If you can talk about how one might go about that, how do you approach that?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's something very unique about the organization that I've observed. So I was wondering we can maybe in our remaining time really dig
Mm-hmm.
deep onto that work because that's something that I don't think other organizations, at least in like, movement work, there's always, like you said, open borders. It's like we're doing the hard and like macho stuff. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, you're telling stories. And
Mm-hmm.
even that is also very much, gendered, right? The kind of
Mm-hmm.
work that's like real work and the work that's like soft work.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to kind of lift that up a little bit more.
Yeah, we start with stories because, that's one of the oldest technologies of um, archiving, one of the oldest technologies of like shifting people's understanding. So many of us come from cultures where storytelling was revered. Um, for me personally, I started writing to document what was happening to me. So that no one could say that it didn't happen. And so for us, with our audio archive, which we're going to start releasing this year, um, it was a space for survivors to just say exactly what happened to them in their own words without the pressure of like sugarcoating or downplaying or sort of softening whatever happened to them. Um, yeah, and to be able to say it in their own words. It was also important for it to be really relational and rooted in bringing in whatever healing practices they also had. Um, for the first 60 stories, we were all interviewed by Amita in person and, making space for us to ground together, um, to, share not just what happened to us, but a little bit more about who we were and are as people, um, as well as to dream together. We asked everyone, like I said, what's their vision for a world without child sexual abuse? And we also asked everyone if you were in another dimension where capitalism didn't exist and all you had to do was heal and you had a toolbox with everything you needed to do that, what's in your toolbox. And it's inlet. You can have anything you want. And that was a really beautiful way to end the audio archive. Like, let's dream together.
Mhm.
Um, and I always say that child sexual abuse survivors in particular are some of the most powerful visionaries because we have to believe that there's a world where the violence that we're experiencing will end.
Mm,
Um, and so why not dream a little bit together and like make space for us to dream together? So I think when it comes to other organizations wanting to collect stories or to hold space or create an archive of survivor stories, it's so important to really honor and ground together for the storyteller and the person witnessing,
mm,
um, and to not rush it, to not be extractive either. We we check in with the storytellers after they share their stories,
Mm,
to not tokenize them either. Um, so often that's the case for survivors. It's like you're expected to perform your trauma,
mm,
or empathy to like convince the people to care, but to actually make space for folks just to share without any expectation of convincing or like performing, has been really important. And then with the archive in particular, folks could be anonymous. They don't have to be public with their stories. And so as we're preparing for the release of the archive, we've checked in with the storytellers a lot on like, do you still want to do it? Do you want to be anonymous? You could change your mind. And for the folks who want it to be anonymous, we've created these sort of characters that they can give input on and they can name. So like they know and we know and they know it's their story, but we've taken out any identifying information so that when the story comes out, it's just what they want it to be out there. And folks can also remove their story from the archive and not have it released at all. So making sure that they have agency in like their stories is really important. Um, and then with the theater project, transmutation to ceremony that we did live in New York, it was really important to lean into the spiritual practices
mm,
of the cast. It features four Black trans women, four Black and Afro-Latina trans women, and they had so many different spiritual practices, and so it was really important to honor that this is a ceremony because that's so many of our cultures. Storytelling is a ceremony.
yeah.
And so really honoring that to not only transmute from them, but onto the audience and back, it is an impactful experience for the audience as well. And how do we also make space for them to, stay grounded and stay present in their witnessing?
Mm.
Um, yeah, I think for us, it's always been about like these stories are so sacred. We're so grateful that our storytellers trust us with them. And so we want to honor their trust, honor their wisdom, um, as we honor their stories.
I think that's so powerful. And also, I think one of the things that I learned, I also was Take Back the Night rape crisis counselor in my college years, is to always get affirmative, ongoing consent.
Absolutely.
Like you can't assume that because once, even if you have a friendship, that each time there has to really be this conversation, and that's something that I think even in the oral history, that just because someone agreed once doesn't
Hmm.
mean, and I do oral history in other contexts, is you continually have to like ask, like, how do for them to have agency over their story. So I really
Hmm.
appreciate that aspect of it. I know you're going to release the audio archive, but I was piqued curiosity of the dreams,
Hmm.
because this series is called Law Plus Liberation, and we ask every interviewee, so we'll ask you shortly,
Hmm.
about your vision of and dreams for liberation. But I was wondering if you can give us some maybe highlights of some
Hmm.
responses, like what does a world without capitalism, a world without sexual violence look like? Again, without identifying, but just what are some of the themes that came up, or the
Hmm.
dreams that came up that you feel are you're able to share?
Yeah. Some of the dreams were, um, honestly access to like food
Mm,
regularly and housing, stability, space to breathe clean air,
mm,
and have access to water. Like they weren't asking for a lot, The dreams were like to be able to create with their friends,
mm,
to work through conflict and like really rooted in conflict being generative. It
mm,
can bring us closer together. a space where children are free and affirmed
Mhm.
and loved, um, spaces to, yeah, create and organize together. That's not just in response to the hardships of the world. It's more space to build new things. Um, Space for communities to like plant food, have access to groceries. Like it was just really beautiful things like that,
Yeah.
and how, which really illuminates that, like, when those things aren't accessible for people, that creates even more fertile ground for rape culture to thrive.
Mm.
Um, and, things that we should be able to depend on these systems for,
Yeah.
and yet we can't. And so for us, collective liberation is looking beyond these systems. So many people believe abolition is just burn it all down. And, sure, but it's also an invitation to be really creative. Um, and to think about what is my community here in this area need for us to, you know, be healthy and happy.
Mm. Right. These systems, reinvestment in care, systems of care versus punishment. So before I ask the last question, which I ask all the interviewees, I wanted to make space for maybe your reflection or comments on things that we haven't covered, but also maybe
Hmm.
in this current political moment that we're
Mhm.
in. And you had earlier connected how empire uses, rape as a tool
Mhm.
also. So this is something that's really global. But just
Mhm.
wondering if, yeah, if you wanted to share your kind of analysis or reflection from the point of view of your work, how do
Mhm.
we understand and analyze the current political moment with this particular, with the Trump administration, authoritarianism, fascism, the war, all of these sort of really, issues like just how,
Mhm.
how are you making sense and meaning of this moment today? Yeah.
Yeah, for me, this political moment, with this administration, authoritarianism, fascism, all of the things that we're seeing, where these things exist, rape exists, child sexual abuse exists, um, and so we have to keep talking about it. I think the what's happened with the Epstein files has illuminated for folks who maybe wouldn't have otherwise thought about this, how rampant child sexual abuse is, and how patriarchal power um, can often be above reproach or without any kind of consequences. And I think some folks are sort of stunned into inaction by the Epstein files, or even with the farm workers movement, um, are really struggling with, like, where does this not happen? Or I don't want to talk about it. This is just too much. It's too much. But I think we have to continue to talk about, like, where all of these issues are. Child sexual abuse is, um, and so our work is very focused on, like, in this movement work, child sexual abuse also is here and here and here and here.
Mm,
It exists across movements. So we have to talk about it. And, like we were saying before, the numbers are there, meaning that, like, survivors are in these movements. Survivors are doing the work.
mm,
Um, you know, According to the CDC, it's 1 in 4 cisgender or 1 in 4 people assigned female at birth and 1 in 13 people assigned male at birth will experience child sexual abuse. And other research shows that it's like 1 in 2 trans people. Um,
Mm. Oh.
the rates are even higher for disabled children, for, children of color. Um, so the numbers are really high.
Mm.
And if we don't make space for people's survivorship, um, not only will like the harm continue to happen, but it will also happen within our movements. We don't make space to acknowledge that like people are also holding this kind of hurt. And it isn't like the soft work, it's like the necessary work. Like we have to center our own healing
Mhm.
and the work that we're doing to heal the world. Um, Otherwise, we're gonna keep replicating harm with each other. Um, and it's not impossible. I think part of why I love Abolition Book Club is because so many folks have already written about what they've tried.
Mm.
Like here's this strategy, here's how we responded to, you know, rape within the queer community, or here's how we responded in this movement space, or, whatever. And it looks different.
Mm.
There's not a one size fits all answer. And I think if folks can accept that it's not a one size fits all, it's uh, different kinds of strategies that, take a lot of different kinds of practices. Um, and it can start small, uh, then I think that can expand people's political imagination to, envision a world without this kind of violence and believe that it's actually possible. Um, and for us, we are a community of belonging for anyone that wants to intervene in rape culture. We have sort of tiered membership where we have our core members who are LGBT, BIPOC survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And then we have our accomplice members who's anyone else that's like, I also don't want this violence to continue happening,
Mm.
even if I'm not of that specific experience. Excuse me. And so given that we're a community for anyone who wants to intervene in rape culture, we invite folks to join us. With the release of our audio archive, we're going to be releasing a toolkit around how do you take care of yourself as you listen to these stories,
Mm.
so that you can stay present and witnessing. You don't have to turn away. Um, with our theater project, we have a filmed version of it. We'll be releasing it for rentals virtually, and we're going to also be releasing a toolkit for folks on like how do you create your own theater project?
Mm.
How do you take survivor stories and, survivor writings and weave them together to create something really beautiful as another way to showcase stories.
Mm.
Um, and so knowing that there's like a community that folks can join and not have to feel like they have to figure it out on their own,
Mm.
uh, and, join us and join our members and getting creative together. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And we would love to, if any resources are already made public, along with your interview, circulate that and also
Mhm.
encourage folks to, rent and screen perhaps the film version of the theater production. I've seen it. It's really phenomenal. So I would definitely encourage that. Um, I did, uh, you made me think about one other question, if I may, which is
Mhm.
that people do get paralyzed. They don't know how to start. Now they know to reach out perhaps to Mirror Memoirs, but is there some kind of things that folks can that a response to the thing of like this is too big, we can't handle it, we don't have time, that you might be able to some language that you might equip folks who want to bring some of these issues into their respective organizations. Because I do think that there is that paralysis, like people are I know from a labor advocate's point of view, the movement is like really still reeling from it. Like, what do
Hmm.
we do? And let's take his name off, but then that doesn't really get to the underlying issue. Is there any sort of wisdom, advice, or like language that you might, or what would you respond if someone said, it's too much, we can't handle it,
Hmm.
I'm stalled. Like, what might
Hmm.
you say if they approached you?
So folks were feeling sort of stuck or stalled, or thinking this is all too much. Um, I would remind people that number one, we're all raised in and living in rape culture.
Mm,
It's actually everywhere, 100% of us.
mm,
Um, and that is too much. And I think it's important that we don't have to figure everything out right away. Like it can start small.
mm,
And part of starting small is listening to survivors. I think when these kind of things become really big, like with the labor movements, like this wasn't the first time a lot of people, it's like people said something earlier. And one of the failures, I think, of a lot of movements is pedestalizing one person.
yeah.
You know, the success of movements is that they're collectively led, and that no one person can be above being held accountable for mistakes or choices or being harmful.
Mm,
Um, and so that's one thing I think a lot of folks just need to really shift how we think about organizing and how we think about movements. And if we're uplifting one person, that's a problem.
mm,
And if we're not listening when people come forward, right when they do, that's the problem.
mm,
For the sake of the movement, like if we're so concerned with remaining legitimate to our oppressors, like we're not going to actually get to any kind of liberation.
mm,
Too often through so many movements, they don't want to, acknowledge that, someone who's become the face or who's been uplifted as a leader can do any wrong because then the opposition can say like, see, look, you
mm,
you guys are bad because this one person did something wrong.
mm,
Like if we're so concerned with the opposition and perception of us as legitimate, like we're not gonna that's not the focus of liberation. They're gonna always find a reason to see us as illegitimate.
mm, mm,
It's part of that's part of why they oppress us. Um, but I think it's important to know that like change can start small.
mm,
Um, it doesn't have to be reactionary. Um, it's an opportunity. This is always an invitation to start to interrogate, even just in your own life, where does rape culture exist? And how have I been impacted by it? To start to then see how it exists within our movements. Um, yeah, hopefully that was
mm.
concise enough.
No, that's perfect. And I just love your phraseology. It's so clear you're a writer of importance of centering healing so that we don't replicate harm. I just um so the last question and that I'm asking everyone that I'm speaking with is what does liberation mean to you? However you define it. And it's interesting, one of the interviewers said, "Oh, these interviews that I'm doing are almost like archives in themselves, and each interviewee is giving it's almost like the kaleidoscope.
Hmm.
They all." sort of relate and resonate and align, but it's always powerful to hear in each person's words, what does liberation mean to you?
To me, liberation means a world where children are safe, all children, where trans and gender nonconforming children feel and are loved and cared for. It's a world where we all have access to safety, and not safety that feels like sort of elusive, but like actual safety.
Mm,
And the food that we need, the resources we need, the community that we need. It's a world where we have the tools and the commitment to moving through conflict,
mm,
um, and can address harm and have the support and community to do so. Yeah,
yeah, that's good.
that's it.
Yeah. And how does storytelling get us to that vision?
um, to me, storytelling gets us there um, because it is a tool of like evidence of how we've tried
Mm,
and a way to sort of keep that memory alive.
mm,
It also can illuminate that, um, it can exist in small ways. Like for me to have shared my story in the audio archive is testament that like I survived what I went through and that now I get to live my life like this. So that, some other little black girl, little black kid who might be going through something really hard can see like a possibility. Um, some old black person can see like a possibility. And I think that's just really powerful to see like there's liberation can like come through many different ways. And it's because of stories that we know that it's possible. I wouldn't have known that I could be a queer trans man, you know, if I hadn't seen versions of that and like heard some of those stories
mm.
either. So yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. And we will share along with the resources that you mentioned and really appreciate everything that Mirror Memoirs is doing. And thank you for time. So,
Yeah, thank you.
mhm.